I'm alive. I shouldn't be.
He should not be alive. This is unfucking believable.
From the heart of trucker America, my boy Reed Coverdale, host of The Naturalist Capitalist.
This is what government does. It sucks.
If you think you're going to win people over by stating commonplaces, you're just selling the other part.
It is about dictating every transaction that you have for the rest of your life.
Mr. Potato Head.
Coverdale is the guy to be president of the United States.
You intimidated me with your perfect 74 status.
That was the beginning of my problems.
He died doing what he loved, chasing a minor.
But I'll put a 50 cal attached to my Suburban.
Libertarians need to get out of New York.
The gulag is going to be in your house.
This guy's a fucking murderer. He deserves to be in a
dungeon. Gotta get him out of that truck at night and get him into the White House.
Hey guys, thank you for tuning in to another episode of The Naturalist Capitalist. I've got a familiar guest back on the show, Tho Bishop. He came on, I don't know, a month ago, but most of you guys know who he is. How you doing tonight, Tho?
Doing great, Reed. Glad to join you.
Yeah, you've kind of taken off more than usual since last time I had you on. You were on with Steve Bannon. You've been kind of blowing up all over the place. What's been going on, man?
Hey, been staying busy, but it's been a good start to the year, and I hope to keep it coming.
Cool, man. First thing I want to ask you about actually is a little off topic. So there's a trucker strike going on up in Canada, and Canada has been this authoritarian hellhole to live in. They've got universal restrictions that you can't ride a bus, you can't take a domestic flight, you basically can't get a job. You basically just can't live a normal life if you're not vaccinated. In the United States, things are a bit different. I'm not vaccinated. I have a steady job. I haven't worn a mask other than on an airplane in over a year now. And you live in Florida. Florida's another state where it's been, very famously free of the COVID regime for the most part. So I was just wondering, what do you think about something like what's going on in Canada taking place here? Would you support that? Would you be kind of skeptical of it? Just what are your thoughts on that?
I've enjoyed your commentary out there that there needs to be an appreciation that there's collateral damage when you have any movement like this sort, right? And this is exactly what non-political action looks like, and it can be very impactful, and sometimes that can be a force for good. But we're seeing some politicians in Canada kind of break here and there, and hopefully that continues, and hopefully that. The Trudeau regime is forced out. the ideal situation there, and that can be done through the leverage they have with supply chains and everything else there. But there's other side of things. There's collateral damage that comes from that. And I think one of the things that I've seen a lot of comments, just not only just with the Canada situation, but with some of the scenes that we've seen in Europe play out and some of these other nations, where you have these massive protests. I think one of the reasons you haven't seen that play out in the U.S. to that same degree is precisely the fact that you have outlets, right? You can travel to Florida, you can travel to New Hampshire. Things have been very different now on partisan grounds for a while. And one of the things I think Canada shows is that there is a demand for COVID tyranny, right? That's one of the sad things is that, you'll see polling out there, or only 20% of Canadians support what's going on up there. That'd be much higher in the U.S. And so I think taking that into account, while if you want to starve off the imperial city of D.C. or use this as a larger pen against some of the evils that are out there at some of those state and local levels, then that's a different conversation. But I think the COVID situation in America is different than what it has been in Canada, what it has been in other areas, though there seems to be some sign of relief. And I think that's one of the interesting things about this is that while the Trudeau regime is refusing to compromise up there in Canada, here across the border, when you have propaganda folks like the crazy Asian doctor lady that's on CNN all the time, when she's out there saying, oh, well, we've got to obviously remove some of these restrictions, I think the fever's broken a little bit here. And so again, you don't necessarily want to put people to destroy communities' economies without having a very the right goal in mind. If things are getting better, hopefully, it will not need to come to that down here.
Yeah, I kind of compare it to the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020. They were very vague about what their goals were,
right?
And then they were also taking out a lot of angst on completely innocent people. Like, you should be making the Minneapolis Police Department uncomfortable,
right.
not the white family dining in the restaurant and screaming at them that they're not anti-racist enough or not. So, I mean, I'm afraid of something like that happening here, because I get it. Like, watching what's happening in Canada, it's exciting. It's, very, it builds a lot of camaraderie and, patriotism, and the idea of like, this is so cool, people sticking together. But people just have to remember, this isn't just a party. Like, you're talking about an already completely broken supply chain that could just, instantly shove tons of people into starvation, and it could backfire and make them hate, instead of Fauci or the current regime. Like, why am I not getting groceries? Why can I not get medicine? Why is my mom in the hospital with whatever and she's not getting the supplies she needs? So, a critical thought just takes place, and a lot of people don't go that far, I guess.
The thin line between self-righteousness and like nihilism, in terms of like you get so wrapped up and convinced of the righteousness of your cause, and like anything you do doesn't matter anymore at that point. And it's easy for that mob mentality to kind of for things that are started off with the most just reasons. These are buttons that you want to use very sparingly because they can become addictive. And that is so again, I think Canada's very just. Again, full support to them, but
yes,
expanding outside of that needs to be done very carefully.
Yeah, totally agree. So this has a little bit more to do with what we're talking about. I saw you put out a tweet, I don't know if it was yesterday or today, but that you underestimated the, I don't know how you put it, but you underestimated the bitch libertarians, basically, like Sarwark, because you never had any worries about the Libertarian Party, but instead they've infiltrated what you called the most successful libertarian organization, which is Young Americans for Liberty. But Lauren Doherty became the executive director, and it seems like she's basically been purging kind of classic Ron Paul style libertarians, defending Liz Cheney, getting upset that people are trying to display any sort of affection for gun culture. So what's going on there? I'm not connected to Young Americans for Liberty, but I sure know a lot of people who are. So what's been going on the last few days?
Yeah, it's honestly, I think the entire story is a tragedy, and it's precisely because I think YAL is, had become one of the most effective political institutions the Liberty Movement has. The success that they were having at electing state reps around the country. I know, there is a free stater who was the Republican majority leader within the New Hampshire State House because of some of the efforts done in that state in particular. They were really building a bench full of very interesting, diehard Ron Paul style libertarians. And then when you had a change in leadership, I knew that once you kind of went from a Republican, someone who had a history of being a Republican, to a capital L libertarian, you're going to influence and have some changes in terms, particularly like cultural issues and things like that. That there was going to be a easy to predict a little bit of a distancing from Trumpism, and whereas YAL back in 2020, was doing events like Marjorie Taylor Greene. It was kind of easy to predict that, okay, well, if you have an LP executive director, that you're probably going to have less of that, right? Fine. What's interesting is that the term that I think applies here is regime libertarian.
Right, that's what it was.
Because ultimately, right, what's happening with YAL right now is that they are hiring talent to onboard this organization, an organization that was built as, started as Students for Ron Paul, that was built off of the effort of a nation of, and multiple generations now of wonderful grassroots activists, people that, wanted to dedicate their time, doing events on campuses for educational purposes, knocking on doors for people they believed in. There's a lot of, blood, sweat, and tears put in this organization to build it up to the point where it is. And to my, the fact that you have a YAL now that had internal memos trying to censor criticisms of, American military intervention overseas because, you don't want to make it seem like we're criticizing us too much for these accidents that happen. We blow up a family in a car, right? Or we don't want to speak too poorly of Liz Cheney because, we should actually be thanking her for standing up to this, orange man bad. Or, hey, don't you dare criticize Kamala Harris for being out of touch and dumb because she's a black woman and it doesn't look very good if a bunch of libertarians are criticizing a black woman who is very dumb and unintelligent for being dumb and being dumb and evil, right? That's a sort of, when you have that creeping into that organization, it's very unfortunate all around. And there's been people that have been let go within this process. There's still a lot of good people within the organization. I'm not trying to paint a broad brush here and saying anyone that still has Yale in their title is a bad guy. Like, you have a remnant that's trying to keep up with the original mission, but it seems from people that I know within the organization, the aggression that they've gone about trying to remake Yale in their own image, which is what they should do from their own perspective, right? If you're going to take over an organization like Yale, you can't, you want to use it to your own purposes. You can't have people pushing a different message there. So it's a rational move, but it is unfortunate considering what Yale used to be and what it should be, given what people invested into it in the past.
Yeah, what I find so ironic is I can understand, like, maybe thinking Marjorie Taylor Greene isn't libertarian enough or something, but then to go, criticize, hatred of Liz Cheney or regime change wars or criticism of Kamala Harris, that makes absolutely no sense. I mean, Marjorie Taylor Greene is much more of an ally than any of those people.
Well, it's just frustrating because the time that we have right now, this is exactly where there's all this populist energy. And so you're taking this, what Yale had become very effective of was building a bench, right? Getting involved in winnable elections where we can get people that, we can get in our orbit a few times a year to hear our perspective of things. And you start building up talent from there. Anthony Sabatini is one of the guys running for Congress this year that I'm most excited about. He was a Yale endorsed sort of candidate here in Florida. It was a good product. It was a good pipeline of talent trying to navigate these waters, and it's just the problem is that energy, that platform there of organizing, conservative college kids in a way that's going to help, win elections. Like that infrastructure is going to be used for some purpose, right? The model is there. People are going to replicate it. There's people trying to replicate it. It's a shame, though, that an organization that should have been in a position to take advantage of that enthusiasm and those, that sort of dedication to a good ideological lens is going to be taken off the field here, and that's it's just a loss from the movement.
Yeah. So I feel like this, this kind of encapsulates what we were talking about on Twitter, the idea of liberalism versus Paleolibertarianism. The strange things that some people who are more liberal libertarians are willing to compromise on, the optics of criticizing a black woman is worse than murdering children in the Middle East. So do you think that this is actually a root problem of liberalism? Is that where this comes from? Do you think there needs to be some conservatism within the culture of libertarianism, or this is what it naturally degrades to? Or would you just expand on that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, I do want to give credit to that there is a type of left libertarian who is very anti-imperialist. They have their own virtues and they do their own thing, and I'm not necessarily trying to paint them in the same brush here. And that's, again, someone in particular within the Lauren Doherty road. I think even the left libertarians would not see an ally there. But I think there is, though, this larger tendency where some of the issues that conservatives are railing against within their own movement, for example, within kind of right-wing intellectual circles, there's been a divide between, the David French group and of people that are recognized by being more they have a very secularist view of power, right? So their answer to the erosion of conservative cultural norms or institutions, things like that, the answer is, okay, well, we just have to convince more people. The answer is, we gotta affect the culture by itself in order to get people to be more along conservative lines, and they reject the idea of using the state as a mechanism of maintaining those sort of institutions. And I think within libertarian circles, you have this dynamic where it's not necessarily the use of the state per se, but there is a form of libertarianism that views all cultural views as equally relevant, equally just, and its tolerance is kind of like the main goal there, right? Tolerance is the key organizing faction here, and therefore within your own property, within your own whatever, you might be able to do whatever you want, but the public square should be tolerant. Society should be tolerant of these various different views, and that can lead itself, obviously, with the militant stride, where we've seen, the sort of the rush to, okay, we've got to make sure that Eastern Ukraine is free from the tyranny of Orthodox Christian autocratic Russia, right? And you have a lot of libertarians that'll fall on those grounds and along those lines. I think in general, though, what that sort of mindset within libertarian circles, that is an element there that was driving the paleo push within the 90s, that recognized that if you do not have a common source of kind of a broadly accepted moral foundation there, which was agreed upon as Christianity in particular, right? Even so, like Murray Rothbard, who was not a Christian himself in terms of belief in, Jesus Christ as the Savior, he recognized that it was the unique benefits of Christian culture that were important for that cultivated the Western traditions of liberalism that we have enjoyed, and so that if we want to enjoy liberalism in the true, in kind of the Lockean sense, that political sense, right? Liberalism as freedom from government for your own, within a certain moral standpoint, but freedom to act within there. If you take it, if you create a cultural vacuum within that, you're going to have that. You're going to end up with a liberty that can't sustain itself. And I think what's interesting is that, there is that historically, right? It used to be popular. Libertarians would describe themselves as liberals within that classical sense, rather than and trying to distinguish itself from a modern sense. I think that there's even an issue within that classical sense of liberalism, to the degree that it was purely secular. You think like Thomas Jefferson carving out all of the miracles within the Jeffersonian Bible. I think that breakaway right there has created a lot of issues that have gone on to create the burdens that we have with modern liberalism that that I think need to be taken into account. And so the same way we're on the conservative side of things, you have this you have this rising post-liberal movement within their thought. I think that some of the reaction that we're seeing within libertarian circles today, call it post-libertarian, call it paleo-libertarian, call it whatever you will, I think a lot of that reflects that similar rejection of a style of secular liberalism that I think is interesting, and I have a bias in this argument. I find myself very much being sympathetic to the post-liberal argument within right circles, but I also freely admit, though, that there is there is, I think, perhaps value in recognizing the different traditions here, even if you're not on that side, where I think it lends itself to a much more cohesive political alliance if you recognize more naturally the degree to which these ethical and cultural foundations matter more than perhaps our view on the state itself. And that kind of plays into some of the larger political stuff. So that's a long kind of rant there, but that's kind of the long thought process that I think was kind of playing out with some of those tweets.
Yeah, sure. So I got a couple questions. One is, I find the modern liberals to be incredibly antithetical to the original, concept of liberalism. I mean,
yeah.
I feel like Bill Maher is one of the only people on a mainstream platform who encapsulates any of those values anymore. I mean, the idea of free speech, of tolerance, of open dialogue, of wanting to live in a free society. There are a lot of people that I frankly used to kind of look up to over the last several years who I have completely thrown in the garbage because they have shown that they don't actually believe in those absolutes of free speech or tolerance. They're actually very intolerant people who are just upset that their culture wasn't dominant to begin with. So do you think that that's just a natural regression of liberalism, that it's very hard to be a Bill Maher who actually stands for freedom of discourse between like abhorrent and, you know, ideas he disagrees with and ideas that he supports? Is it just natural that most liberals do want to rise to the top and then become very authoritarian in their mindset?
I think there's a nature where I appreciate what Bill Maher is saying right now, and I appreciate points that Bill Maher has had in his career. I don't think that he's been a reliable ally, right, in general.
I'm not suggesting that. I just think that there's a free speech and, you know. Yeah.
Sure. And the reason I bring that up is I think there is definitely an aspect where, you know, it's, you know, once the water gets too hot, you know, you have some people that sort of reacting to it, and it's kind of it's a self-preservation thing, because even though they have been okay to play this game of, you know, imposing their cultural views, and really I think ultimately, you know, these are religious views, right? Even if they are not Christian, even if they're not theist, right? There is a religious element to anyone, to morality in general, right? And so to the degree to which, and Bill Maher I think is more thoughtful than your average guy. I think he probably has, you know, even if we're all hypocrites in terms of here and there, I think he has, you know, his own sort of thought out, generally sort of political views. I think that he'd be perfectly okay with crushing, you know, a lot of, you know, mandating a drag queen story hour in public libraries because, you know, it teaches tolerance to communities and things like that other people would find an absolutely abhorrent use of their tax dollars, right? I think that Bill Maher doesn't have any problem at all with using cancel culture if as long as he agrees on, you know, whatever the authoritarian aspect of the state that he criticizes against COVID rightfully. I think he'd be okay with using it in some sort of end that he thought was correct, right? Mm-hmm. And I think what's interesting with the COVID stuff, though, is seeing, okay, well, this is too much for certain people. And so that leads up with the Barry Weisses of the world, you know, saying, oh, you know, this is crazy. And sure. So now you have these people that are on the left, not the far left, but I mean, I think are still liberals, you know, culturally and otherwise, that have realized that the game has gone too close to their comfort zone, or over time have learned that this whole thing is nonsense. And so again, while it's always important to celebrate whenever you have these things going on, I don't think necessarily, though, I think it's less about them as much as it is just a demonstration to the degree to which you still have people to the far side of them, you know, let's call it left, you know, are so disconnected to where we are. Right, it's more a reflection on how far out they are when they're criticizing that than it is, say, you know, these are good liberals to point to. It's just this particular element has made them good liberals from a liberty perspective, or any, you know, what we would think about as being on the right side of this.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, I was not suggesting that Bill Maher is necessarily an ally to libertarianism. He's just somebody who's always been willing to have, like, he had Milo Yiannopoulos on his show, had Ben Shapiro on his show. He's been very against the woke, like, canceling of somebody that doesn't hold the same opinion he does. He does have authoritarian government views for sure, but when it comes down to dialogue, he's always been, you know, let that guy speak and let's ridicule him if we disagree with him by proving him wrong or whatever. I guess you could use Joe Rogan as another example of somebody who's been very open to letting anyone say whatever they want when they come on his platform, which is why it's so disappointing to see him apologize and now start caving to the mob and everything. It seems like it's very, very rare that any of these liberals or people who call themselves free speech absolutists, you know, really end up becoming that. I mean, they eventually have some standard that they will say, this is too much, you can't say this, this is too dangerous, this is disgusting, or whatever, is basically what I'm getting at.
Yeah, and to be fair, they should. I've got nothing against that. Like, for example, the Mises Institute is dedicated to liberalism, free speech, whatever, right? You know, freedom. But like, I mean, the Mises Institute isn't going to provide a platform to someone who wants to, talk about Keynesian economics, because there's plenty of other platforms for that, right? Like necessarily, you're going to have limits to the entire goal, I think, of like neutrality is a myth, right? There's never going to be a neutral platform, and that's okay. Like the answer is that we don't need to have some sort of mass universal. There was nothing ever anything wrong with Twitter censoring child porn, right? Because it's not a neutral platform, right? And I think that's one aspect where there was a myth of this that I think has affected the practicality of neoliberalism, this liberal order, whatever you want to describe the status quo. And I think that is what you're seeing as the reaction on the right. That's why you're seeing a lot more emphasis on school curriculums and banning books, that certain sort of books and things like that. You have conservatives recognizing that public education is not going to be a neutral platform, right? And therefore, we want to take out some of this sort of stuff. I think the same degree, while the kind of the question that comes within libertarian circles, because we can easily bypass this by saying there should be no public schools, and therefore that makes that okay. So you're going to have Christian schools and whatever. That as the answer to some of this sort of stuff. I think even when it comes to the enforcement of, it lends itself to some of these debates going on about dealing with Twitter and corporate platforms, where the idea is that these organizations can exist within a neutral landscape, and therefore any censorship they have is the product of the market or some sort of non-political mechanisms. Whereas, the argument, whereas my argument, my defense of saying, some of the stuff like Ron DeSantis has been trying to do with our social platform sphere is that no, when you're dealing with such a heavily influenced environment, right? There is no such thing as a neutral corporate platform, right? There's always some sort of underlying a filter that's going to be applied here, and when it's being used explicitly for political ends, that is a danger to the power structures that be. And I think that recognizing that the limits of what the marketplace of ideas really provides, either from the state level or from a corporate perspective and downwards, these are some things that I think have been kind of, there are parallels to the conversations that are happening on the right that need to happen in libertarian circles, and I think are trickling out, that I think are significant.
Yeah, so I have never thought of libertarianism as much of a, well, let me put it this way. I've never looked at it as a way to achieve the fullness of morality. I mean, it's pretty basic. It's don't steal your neighbor's stuff, don't kill anybody unless you're protecting yourself. Don't aggress against anyone unless they aggress against you. You own yourself and your property, and that's pretty much it. Like, it's nothing like when you read the Bible and Jesus is telling you to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, carry the centurion's backpack an extra mile. Like, there's nothing about forgiveness in it. There's nothing about, being caring. Like, it's completely libertarian if some, dude who's dying of thirst crawls up to your doorstep and you have water in your house and he just says, "Can I have a glass of water?" and you slam the door in his face and say, "Get off my property." It's your property. You can do with it what you want. You can say, "This guy has no right to be here. I'm going to remove him." But it's not the virtuous or good thing to do. So I feel like libertarianism, the non-aggression principle, some people try to look at it as a religion or as a guide for the fullness of morality. And, both the people who are criticizing it and some of the people who are holding it up as the gold standard, the end all be all, the answer to everything, I just find them kind of both missing the point that the non-aggression principle is what it says it is. It's just about non-aggression. It's just about not hurting each other. So when you're looking for, fulfillment, you're probably not going to find it in libertarianism. And so some people have religion like Christianity or, whatever you want to choose. Other people find it in hobbies or family or whatever it is. But I think it's the mistake to try to cast libertarianism and non-aggression as an all-encompassing philosophy that will make you happy and feel fulfilled in life.
Sure. You know, the mistake of trying to make thin libertarianism thick libertarianism,
right.
You know, I do think it's an issue. So the question then is, okay, what fills the rest of that void? And I think that I think that the mistake that libertarians make is viewing as I think taking individualism too far in failing to recognize that the strongest communities are the ones that share the common values, and that the relationships for a strong community are not purely economic ties. That there is these elements of duty and obligation that come with being part of a community, and that those communities are strongest when they have a shared ethical framework and a common value system. And then the question then is, okay, what is the foundation that lends itself to the strongest framework that bolsters and protects human liberty and human thriving? And that's where I think that the Christian argument there is very important and I think very, very persuasive. But even if that is for people that are not Christians, that's fine. I think there needs to be greater appreciation though that you're going to need to have that ethical foundation, right? The idea that you can just plug and place people without any sort of consideration for what is going to be the civic religion, because simply not declaring a civic religion isn't going to stop a civic religion from coming up, right? Right. And it's like America right now. It's we are no longer a Christian nation. We are now we have a secular religion. Martin Luther King Jr. is a saint within the American civic religion.
Sure.
And along with George Washington, is for so until at least for right now, he's a secular saint. Abraham Lincoln is right for the Union. George Floyd has become one, right? Juneteenth is his feast day. Yeah. And so what we've done is that we over time, over the course of the 20th century, we have substituted Christianity with this new religion, and that creates issues because we don't identify it as such. We think of it is sold as the liberal separation of church and state, but that we have created. We're in a more a rational age because Christianity is at its all-time lows. And I don't think that society, if you look around a society today, we're seeing a culturally healthy society. And so I think that should draw people to have some reevaluation in terms of, are we in a culturally good place the more that we have distanced ourselves from Christianity, in particular in the West, but away from having these conversations in general, in terms of, thinking about things in a collectivist sense, but I think still very much an important one when you're thinking about social trust and the actual institutions that lend itself to human liberty thriving.
Sure. So I agree with a lot of what you said there, and it's been an evolution of mine over the last several years, seeing how people have reacted. I was raised Christian, and I was a pretty staunch believer till my late teens, and then eventually by the time I was 22, I kind of came to terms with the fact I didn't believe in any of it. But what you're describing is true. Like, whether or not there is a religion that's established, one will form. And what we've seen, I would say, is actually worse than what than his predecessor. The thing, though, is, like you were mentioning, Rothbard was an atheist. Like, he didn't actually believe in God. He didn't believe in Jesus. I think Mises was too, and Hoppe is as well, right? Is that correct?
I'm not certain about Hoppe.
Okay.
But it definitely is the case within both Rothbard and Mises.
Right.
So it's essentially both of them, particularly Mises in particular. When he was in Europe, he was very dismissive of Christianity. By the time he writes Theory and History, his views definitely become a lot more sympathetic. But yes, they're still non-believers.
Yeah. So I mean, I completely agree with you, and we were talking about this on Twitter that there are a lot of people who do need the Bible or something like the Bible. They need a belief in an all-powerful God to justify their existence, to strive for anything. You and I could both go on a 10-mile hike in New Hampshire in 5 below zero weather and 4 feet of snow in snowshoes, And might come away from that saying, wow, that was the greatest experience ever. That was awesome. I loved all of it. And you'd be like, Reed, what the fuck is wrong with you? We're freezing to death. Let's go to the beach in Florida. So we both had the exact same experience, but we came away from it with completely different outlooks or opinions. So anyone who can arrive at, a libertarian society where it's flourishing and people are productive and they're getting along and peaceful, I really don't care how they get there. I mean, even if they're like a fundamentalist Muslim and they somehow arrive there, which would make no sense to me, but it's like, okay, whatever, you ended up there. That's cool. That's your journey. It's not mine. What I see though, is there is a lot of disdain for people like me who are not religious, who try to justify things in a secular way and try to convince people in a secular way. And the only time that I ever go out of my way to take shots at Christianity is when I either see somebody get attacked or I get pushed far enough, and then I'll finally push back. Like, I think, Tom Woods is great. Ron Paul is great. I don't care how they got to their, where they are. And those two have never, ever, tried to push their religion on me, and I just don't care. But there are a lot of, there's this like new, I don't know if it's new, but this noticeable movement within the liberty circles where it seems like they're trying to purge atheists, even, and I'm not talking about like the, I've been called a Reddit atheist. I think that's very unfair. Like, I think Reddit atheists are the toxic ones who are, when someone's parent is dying in the hospital and they're asking for prayers and they comment, "You dumbass, there is no God." Like, I mean, those people are detestable. I hate them and they hate me just as much. But people like me, and I'd say like Rothbard and like Mises, who just don't have a personal faith, don't believe in a faith, and don't embrace the faith, but don't like try to disparage people who believe in whatever they want. It seems like there's even, an angst against people like us. I don't know if you see it the same way, so I'll let you comment.
No, I think there is, and again, I think this is something that is reflected. I don't think it's something limited to the libertarian space. I think some of it is just is coming, radiating off of some of the energies that are happening elsewhere. Again, I think we're just in this very interesting, weird time where people are reevaluating all sorts of different aspects, and I think there's this broader reevaluation of materialism in general, and I think that is naturally lends itself to religious awakenings in all sorts of interesting ways. And I think that there becomes I think that there's a fundamental distrust of non-religious moral foundations. And I think that ultimately becomes a concern with if you are seeing if you think about everything we've seen, obviously, in the last few years, is a radical acceleration of tyranny, where you have family members ratting to the FBI on each other, a complete breakdown of trust, family structures, all that sort of traditions. I think it creates a society that is unsure of what it can stand upon. And so it gets to the point where the only thing that you can trust is faith or God. And therefore anyone who they might come across as allies on a lot of issues, if they are wrong on that one big issue, then there's distrust all around.
Sure.
And I'm someone who I appreciate, like, the way I kind of see this is that I think there's always room for outliers, right? I think it is absolutely possible to be an atheist and to be a good neighbor within a Christian society. And part of that just comes from a personality that is not disrespectful, right? Which goes to the Reddit atheist question. But I think you can absolutely have that. I think ultimately, though, if you do not, that is an atheist in a Christian society. I think if you, I have become, and again, I have the complete opposite story of you. Like, I grew up, my parents had strong religious beliefs, but we never went to church, so I was grew up in a very agnostic sort of family, upbringing. Only recently have become a lot more interested in finding Christianity filling some areas that I've found personally rewarding. I do think there is a bad neighbor problem that exists within certain parts of the libertarian movement, and we all know certain people, I think, yeah. And there is that retreat where, okay, you have a filter that is going to filter out, 90% of bad people at the expense of 10% good people. Mm-hmm. If you have, if you're trying to create things to out of protection, like that's not a bad hitting rate, right? And I think particularly given where Twitter's at, where Twitter is so much rewards dunking and kind of tribalism in the most fiery sort of sense, and I can fall in this trap as well as anyone. I think those two together, combined with some of the larger conversations and larger feelings out there, I think definitely lends to that sort of aspect to it. But yeah, and again, we are living in very turbulent, I think, times in a variety of different ways, which is going to lead to, there's going to be a lot of unfortunate byproduct out there. Just hopefully some of the answers that are coming out from some of these questions being asked, translate into meaning, long-lasting advances to a good end rather than a very bad end, which is certainly possible in all this sort of stuff.
Yeah, I want to speak to what you said about Twitter, because that's very true. When you view the libertarian movement through a Twitter lens, I think it's a very distorted, unhealthy, negative view of what's actually happening, just because I've been to, a few big libertarian events and everybody's friendly, everyone's talking to each other, everyone's, happy to be there. Pork Fest, Tom Woods 2000, Freedom Fest, like those were all great places where, I don't know, a little bit of hope was reinstated after visiting them and realizing that we don't all hate each other as much as we think we do. One question I have is, because I come from the hard, evangelical right, and what you just described about mostly atheist Americans over the last few years, I think is in general true. I mean, there's been some religious people too, but the majority of the atheists in the country have probably been more aligned with the COVID regime over the last few years. I think that's accurate. I will grant you that. What I would say is the ultra religious movement that I came from in the early 2000s was probably more proportionally responsible for the rapid expansion of the state under George W. Bush. And I realized George W. Bush didn't have the same messages about foreign policy and probably immigration that the modern populist right does. But if you listen to him talk about Christianity, 20 years ago, it's very hard to discern. And I know, lots of people in my family, lots of close friends who just bought it hook, line, and sinker. And then we ended up with the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, the Patriot Act. And then you had all sorts of cultural stuff like the Satanic Panic. And, if you read Harry Potter, you were a Satanist or whatever. So I'm just not convinced that Christianity actually is an antidote to tyranny. I don't think historically that's been proven. I think it can be. And it's interesting to see how it's used on both sides, because you have Christians in the early 2000s, like my parents, who, they were outliers in our family. They were the only ones against the war in Iraq. And we were protesting it on the side of the road in 2003 when I was a kid. And they were using Christian arguments against it. 9/11 was bad, but why are we bombing kids in Iraq? That doesn't make any sense. You had Christians on both sides of the abolitionist movement. With slavery, you had Christians on both sides of the Vietnam War, so I'm just not convinced that it actually is this all-saving antidote that works. I mean, I think it can be, but depending on where you are on the timeline, it has certainly been weaponized in the opposite direction. And I'm not convinced that it's actually been more more positive than negative. I mean, if you look at the Vietnam War, that's another great example where most of the Christians were probably in support of the Vietnam War. Most Christians have been in support of the war on drugs. Most Christians have been in support of a lot of policies that have just completely destroyed this country. So just like you were saying, Bill Maher, like he seems like a great ally right now because he's speaking out against what's going on with the COVID regime. I look at it that way with Christians, this isn't an outside looking in thing. Like, I was there. I grew up in a church that was very pro-Iraq war, grew up in a family that was mostly very pro-Iraq war, friends that were mostly pro-Iraq war, and they were not like just casual Christians. They were, let's go to church on Sunday, prayer meeting Wednesday nights, read the whole Bible. This is real. Like, you need to actually be sorry for your sins. Like, I mean, it was the whole deal. So I don't know. I'll just let you respond. What do you think?
I mean, it's definitely true that, Christian Americans have been on the wrong side of a variety of things. I think that the 9/11 example was more about Americanism than Christianity. I think, you did have pockets of very strong anti-war organization within, and particularly the most traditional sort of Christian, movements too tend to be the ones that are the most iconoclast in terms of any major sort of political issue, and I think to the credit. But I think that is just part of America as a secular religion. I don't think that atheists were any less interested in bombing the Middle East in that period. So I don't think it was necessarily a Christian generated thing. I do think you could perhaps point to in like 2004 the degree to which gay marriage was used as a means of the Bush administration to maintain power. And I think you can even point to 2000 as an example of the cultural progressive agenda of the Clintons pushing a massive, you even had a major realignment of politics there, with Republican Party politics becoming more, defined by evangelical, Christianity and things like that. Part of that was a reaction to cultural differences happening within the Democratic Party, pushing, those Christian conservative voters in a very partisan direction one way. But
I just want to clarify that I didn't mean to insinuate that Christianity was what.
Sure, you're right. You're just saying, yeah.
Just that it was not a sufficient deterrent.
Sure. No, I agree. Okay. Again, I agree, and I think particularly, you have. I do think to one point you made, I do think you find various historical episodes where the church, has been a stand against very authoritarian regimes. I know, like the role, for example, of the Orthodox Church in the Soviet Union. But to be fair, there have been corruptions of church institutions on behalf of states, and I'm not blind to that at all. I think ultimately, however, the criticisms that were made against the war were themselves influenced by Christian morality, right? The idea that it was wrong for Americans to hurt, that it's wrong for us to hurt people of other tribes and other nations, right? Those arguments themselves, used even by non-Christians against American foreign policy, have typically been ones that have been shaped by what the West has come to view as morality itself through that Christian lens. And I think this is one of those elements that is, if we're looking at the decay of the West right now, is that you have Western civilization, which was founded upon a very specific ethical foundation. I mean, the West was built by Christianity. It was Christendom. Like that was the operating processor there. And it has been with the degree of secularism that we've seen within the West, and not just in the U.S. and perhaps less in the U.S. and other areas, but just the West in general, and having it manifested itself as well with various changes within how we define marriage. Some of those institutional sort of arguments that once upon I was a big pro-gay marriage guy during the Obama years, all that sort of stuff, right? I used to criticize Obama for not being pro-gay rights enough and things like that. I think, however, it is fair. I find myself looking back in hindsight, though, seeing the degree to which this neoliberal regime has redefined these institutions away from Christian definitions, and seeing what is the consequences of it, and as every day passes on, the more I find myself questioning the virtue of what has long been celebrated as a great victory for cultural liberalism and the growth of a secular, less oppressive state, I'm not sure if that has actually lended itself to a culture that is pro liberty. And I think the connection with like the COVID stuff is that necessarily if you do not believe in the afterlife, like your time preference changes, right? I think there is this degree to which now there are plenty of supernatural, non-religious reasons to have that sense, right? If you have a child, right, you want to live, you create an example for your offspring to follow, right? That is a way of living beyond yourselves. But with this same, the same era of cultural liberalism, or whatever you want to call this modern age, right? They're going after natalism, right? They're going after the family. They're going, instead of having kids, have dogs, right? And I think that is, again, if we're looking for how do you define a decaying culture, I think there, you can pit a lot of, I think a lot of the arguments that I would have used to dismiss in the past as like slippery slope Christian theocratic arguments against obviously good changes to government, a lot of those arguments in hindsight seem less and less slippery, and again, I'm not necessarily quite to Gary North's level when it comes to these issues, but I'm saying that Gary North looks a lot better than he did 5 years ago, and that's kind of where I find myself. And again, the degree to which there's some parallels with other areas out there, I think it's just interesting that these are the conversations that are being held in other areas, not just the ghetto of libertarian Twitter, but in other different movements out there.
Yeah. So the way I look at a lot of this is, I think there can be a lot of truth in something without it being absolutely true. And that's the way I look at the Bible. Like, I think that the Bible has a ton of wisdom in it, a ton of great ideas how to live in a virtuous society. I also think it has a lot of crazy stuff in it and some really bad ideas. But what I find a problem with people is they either need to embrace the entirety of something or just completely reject it. So, I mean, you see this a lot with libertarians even. Like, some libertarians, when they're curious with the philosophy, they find one thing they don't like, and they're like, nope, it's all trash. And it's like, well, hold on. Like, why would it all be trash? Just because you can't reconcile this one piece, why would you throw the baby out with the bathwater? So I think, when I hear people say we need Christian values, I don't necessarily disagree with the sentiment behind what they're saying. It's just the phrasing of the term. Like, I agree, we need a society that is more caring, that is more forgiving, that is more generous, that is less vindictive, less hateful, less wanting to control others. I think if everyone followed, I'd even say if everyone followed, like, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself, we'd have no problems. Like, even though I don't believe in God, if people were trying to worship God and, remove their selfishness and really just try to live for his commands and other people, I think we would have a practically perfect world. I think there's just a chunk of people who don't believe that the same way. And I think that chunk of people is getting bigger, this is why I wouldn't consider myself a conservative, because I'm always looking, I look to the past for sure for examples, but I'm also looking forward, like, what is actually going to work going forward. And I don't think like trying to indoctrinate people into Christianity is necessarily the right move. And especially when so many Christians are saying things like, if you don't believe in this philosophy, then you have no basis for believing in any absolutes. You have no basis for morality. You have no basis for individualism. Because if they tell people that, then they'll believe them. Then they'll say, okay, well, I guess I'm a communist because I don't believe in God or whatever. So I think there's, I'm not going to try to discourage Christian libertarians from reaching out to people in their own way. I've got good friends, Liam McCollum, Jacob Winograd, a bunch of people who do that. But I just think that, trying to exclude people who have a different approach is a mistake, and I just don't want to see that happen. I want to see, I care, you're talking about time preference with people who don't believe in God. You're 100% correct. that's why I do care so much about stuff, because I think this is all I got. I mean, I could be wrong, could be something else after this, but I don't know. So I care about what I can do to make this world better while I'm here, what I can do to make it better for people after me. If this was just a waiting room to the next life, I don't think I would care so much about it. That's just how I look at it. But I'm just hoping for a future where those two factions don't need to be split. So I don't know. Those are my thoughts.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I think at one point, I don't think that it is Christians judging. I don't think that the trend to nihilism or some of the destructive things that we're seeing culture within society is a backlash to Christians saying, well, if you don't believe in this, then you have no sense of morality, and then therefore you can be the Joker. I think that we have a culture that's subsidizing that behavior, that's pushing that idea. I think that it's interesting. There's a book called on leftism, written by a Austrian political theorist that was associated with the Institute, and he identifies Marquis de Sade as one of the most influential thinkers on the left. And like you look around society today, like Western society today, like it is very much a sadistic society, and I think there's a lot of value in there. And so I think that it is not a backlash to Christianity that's feeding that. I think it is the removal of Christianity from society that is creating, that's pushing us to the environment we have right now. And it's gotten to the point where, again, while I don't think that every single person has to be a believing Christian, I have grave doubts about the success of any political libertarian movement on a broad scale if we do not have Christian revivalism in America. Like I think that you could have pockets. Like I think that you could have, for example, your Galt's Gulch, right? You could have your opt-out societies where you have a bunch of galaxy brain crypto bros go to Honduras and start a free society, and they create a perfectly privatized society. I think that could happen, right? I think that that opt-out model where you create a private, I think that's fine. But I think in terms of everyone else that doesn't have that ability, I think that a less Christian society ends up becoming a less freer society. And I think there's a lot of interesting, I think that's a trend that you can see play out very well throughout history. Off of Matt Erickson's recommendation, I finally finished Dominion by Tom Holland, which is a wonderful book. I'm someone who, again, I the history of ideas and seeing the way they percolate and throughout time is really what gets me. It's like Rothbard's Austrian history of economic thought was really kind of what made me an Austrian. And then that book opened my eyes in a lot of ways. But I think that's something that I do. And conversely, when I look at the world today and I look at where are the areas where I have the most hope for pushing back against some of the trends that we're seeing right now, it is South America, particularly Brazil, but other areas of South America. That's my conservative argument for more immigration at the borders, because I want to have a lot more Hispanic Christians. Let them outnumber white atheists graduating from Ivy League colleges. I think that'd be a good thing for society. But also within Africa and comparing Eastern Europe versus Western Europe, even though a lot of defendants of like Hungary and things like that will overlook really bad like COVID policies. Like there's all those are worth taking into account. I think it's going to be interesting the degree to which what we would consider, or at least what I would consider, the best libertarian movements are going to be the ones that overlap with the nations that I think are going to end up being more culturally Christian. And that is a hypothesis on my part. It might be completely wrong, but that is the sort of prediction that this thought process that I'm still developing. I'm not. It's an area that I have written about a lot on, because I'm still processing a lot of this sort of stuff. But that is the sort of things this thought process leading me to where I think the secular versus Christian world is going to be very defining. I think in a way a lot of this stuff ends up percolating in political realities.
Yeah. Last question I got for you. What do you think about New Hampshire? I'm moving back there in a few months. Florida is probably more similar to what you're describing as becoming a success, because you're trying to bring people who have not just a belief in liberty, but it seems like much more conservative with a more religious overtone to it in general, where New Hampshire is actually the most atheist state in the country, and it's really just about like the philosophy of liberty. So what are your long-term assumptions of what's going to happen in New Hampshire versus Florida?
Ron DeSantis, I mean, like, he brought prayer back to schools.
Right.
So I think it's great. It can also be meditation periods. I know, but right now they're pushing on legislation that would prevent public schools from talking about LGBTQ issues entirely. I mean, there is a very strong push going on from the Florida government right now on these issues. The leftists are reacting as you would expect. But yes, particularly as someone who is looking at migration patterns, like I would be perfectly okay with if Florida's public education system ends up enforcing cultural views that are going to be keep out the people that will end up on the libs of TikTok Twitter page. I'd be quite happy with that. The contrast though with New Hampshire, I mean, again, I would love for New Hampshire to be the exception to prove wrong. There's a lot of great people in New Hampshire. Right? The libertarian movement within New Hampshire is my favorite, I think, libertarian group out there. Like they make it work. And maybe there's something to be said about long-standing, small iconoclast communities in New England. Being where freedom really lies. I mean, we can go back to Rhode Island as some of the great resistance against all the early imperialism and tyranny of early America. So again, I would love if New Hampshire can continue on the path that it has been on, and continuing to be able to preserve itself as a free state. That'd be great. There has been political trends that I've found concerning over time. They've been much better after 2020. We'll see how they go going forward. But perhaps New Hampshire can be a state that has does not have a cultural void that the left is able to fill, but perhaps a aggressively pro-liberty cultural foundation that can fill that void that Christianity otherwise does within a society. I think that there is a lot of virtue that you can find within various ethical frameworks brought about by secular libertarians, and if that can really play that role, and more power to you. I would love to have my doubts be proven wrong, and I am glad that there is both New Hampshire and Florida out there, so that people can locate depending on whether they like to go snow hiking in the mountains or enjoy the beaches down here. But the freedom to choose is not a bad thing overall.
Yeah, man, I'm very interested to see long term how both of our states end up turning out. Well,
the key is keeping these states on the trajectory that they are right now, rather than have them become some sort of homogenous blob like the rest of lesser America.
Absolutely, yeah. We're in the I guess Maine is basically an extension of New Hampshire, though. There's like no people there. It's just moose and like a couple people. So we got us on the two corners of the East Coast of the country. So it'll be interesting. Well, thanks for joining me again, Tho. I always like talking with you. You have become probably my favorite Twitter follow, even though we disagree on some stuff. I just can't stress how much I love that you are never passive aggressive. You're never subtweeting. You will always call out exactly who you intend on speaking to. You'll quote tweet whoever you're arguing with. You are unabashedly bold with what you believe, and you're not afraid to talk about it. And then you're also not afraid to come and talk on the show. We need more people like you. So thank you, Tho.
Well, I appreciate you reading. Again, I'm excited to see that you just keep blowing up, and great job on Kennedy.
Thanks, man. By the way, I just got your Twitter in here. Is there anywhere else you want anyone to follow you?
Yeah, if I've got a Liberty versus Power history podcast with Patrick Newman that we've been having some fun with. We've been going through kind of the rise of the early corruption in early America. So if you're have any interest in history podcasts and things like that, Liberty versus Power at the Mises Institute website.
All right, thanks, Tho. We'll do it again.
Great.